1922. The Fayum Depression, 40 miles southwest of Cairo. The sun has been down for 3 hours, and the desert temperature has dropped 40 degrees in that time. British archaeologist Reginald Engelbach crouches in a trench 16 feet below the sand, his carbide lamp casting shadows that dance across hieroglyphics no human has seen in nearly 4,000 years. His hands are shaking, not from cold, from what he is reading. The inscription is carved into limestone that forms the entrance to something that should not exist according to everything Egyptology understands about Middle Kingdom burial practices. The hieroglyphs are pristine, protected by sand that filled this space within decades of its construction and remained undisturbed until Engelbach's team broke through 3 days ago. The message is repeated 7 times in descending rows, each iteration slightly smaller than the one above it, creating a visual effect that draws the eye downward into darkness. The translation makes Engelbach's stomach tighten. Beyond this threshold lies the correction of Mot through methods the sun god must not witness. Those who enter bearing impurity will achieve purification through geometry. Those who enter bearing knowledge of exit will die bearing knowledge of nothing. The labyrinth of Amenemhat, the second, swallows all paths except the path of divine will. Engelbach has been excavating in Egypt for 11 years. He has translated thousands of funerary texts, temple inscriptions, and administrative records. He has never encountered language like this. Egyptian religious writing is formulaic, predictable, designed to guide souls through the afterlife using tested phrases accumulated over millennia. This inscription breaks every convention. It does not mention the afterlife. It does not invoke protection from gods. It describes active present-tense operations. A labyrinth. Methods the sun god must not witness. Purification through geometry. Behind him, his Egyptian foreman Ahmed Hassan is arguing in Arabic with the local workers. They want to leave. They have heard stories about this place passed down through generations of Fayum villagers. Stories about the maze that eats people, about sounds that come from beneath the sand on certain nights, about animals that refuse to cross certain boundaries in the desert. Ahmed is trying to convince them that these are superstitions, that they are archaeologists doing scientific work, that there is nothing to fear from buildings constructed 4,000 years ago by people who are dust. The workers are not convinced. One of them points to the inscription and says something in Arabic too rapid for Engelbach to follow. Ahmed translates reluctantly. The worker says his grandmother told him that the British would come eventually, that foreign archaeologists would find what should remain lost, that when they opened the maze, the old gods would remember what humans taste like. Engelbach dismisses this as exactly the kind of superstitious nonsense that impedes archaeological progress. But dismissing it does not stop his hands from shaking as he prepares to descend into the structure beyond the threshold, does not stop his mind from cataloging the wrongness of what he is seeing. Egyptian tombs and temples are designed according to strict theological principles. They face east to greet the rising sun. They incorporate specific measurements derived from sacred geometry. They include offering chambers and statue niches and inscriptions that communicate with divine forces according to established protocols. This structure violates every principle. It faces north, toward the realm of Set the Chaos God. Its entrance is unmarked from the surface, hidden beneath sand, designed to be invisible rather than monumental. Its measurements, as far as Engelbach can determine from preliminary surveys, follow no known Egyptian system. The walls are thicker than necessary for structural support. The passages are narrower than standard corridor dimensions. The whole complex gives the impression of something built not to preserve or honor, but to contain and conceal. What was Amenemhat II, hiding in the desert 40 miles from his capital? Here is what they never taught you in school about ancient Egypt. You know about the pyramids of Giza, architectural marvels that have fascinated humanity for millennia. You know about the Valley of the Kings, where pharaohs were buried in tombs, decorated with scenes of the afterlife. You know about Tutankhamun and his golden mask, about Cleopatra and her intelligence, about hieroglyphics and mummies and the Rosetta Stone that unlocked their language. But you have never heard about the labyrinth structures built during the 12th dynasty, construction projects that required more labor and resources than pyramid building, but which left almost no surface traces. You have never learned about the theological crisis that occurred during Amenemhat II's reign, when traditional afterlife beliefs collided with new ideas about divine judgment that required different architectural solutions. You've never discovered what chemical analysis of human remains found in these structures reveals about methods of death that Egyptian medical texts do not describe. Why dozens of these labyrinth complexes were built across Egypt during a 70-year period and then never built again, as though the entire civilization decided simultaneously that this architectural form was too dangerous to continue. How Greek historians, writing 1,000 years later, described Egyptian labyrinths as more impressive than the pyramids, but more terrifying than any temple, places where even priests feared to enter without elaborate preparations. Tonight you will learn why Engelbach's discovery in 1922 was immediately classified by the Egyptian Antiquities Service, and why portions of his field notes remain sealed in Cairo Museum archives a century later. What ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the 1990s revealed about the true extent of Amenemhat's labyrinth, dimensions that make it one of the largest underground structures in the ancient world. How analysis of tool marks on labyrinth walls suggests construction techniques specifically designed to confuse spatial orientation and create psychological effects on people moving through the passages. Why human remains discovered in the deepest chambers show signs of death from dehydration and starvation despite being surrounded by evidence of food and water, as though victims lost the ability to recognize survival resources that were literally within reach. If you want to understand how ancient civilizations could develop technologies of cruelty so sophisticated that modern psychologists recognize them as engineered trauma systems, subscribe right now and comment below where in the world you are watching from. Because what Amenemhat built in the desert was not a tomb or a temple. It was something else entirely. Something that reveals the true function of sacred architecture when theology becomes a weapon and geometry becomes a method of erasing human minds. Let me take you back to the Middle Kingdom to understand the world that created this nightmare in limestone and shadow. 1912 years before the birth of Christ, Egypt is experiencing what historians call the Middle Kingdom, a period of stability and prosperity, following the chaos of the First Intermediate Period. Pharaoh Amenemhat II has ruled for 33 years. His reign is characterized by ambitious construction projects, expanded trade networks with Mesopotamia and the Levant, and reforms to religious institutions that concentrate power in the pharaonic administration. This is Egypt's classical age. Literature flourishes with works like the Tale of Sinuhe that will be copied and studied for the next 1,000 years. Mathematics advances with calculation methods for volumes and areas. Medicine develops anatomical knowledge and surgical techniques. The visual arts reach peaks of sophistication in sculpture and painting. By every external measure, this is Egyptian civilization at its height. But underneath the prosperity, theological tensions are building that will eventually require architectural solutions. Traditional Egyptian afterlife beliefs hold that the soul faces judgment in the hall of Ma'at, where the heart is weighed against the feather of truth. Those whose hearts balance with the feather proceed to the field of reeds, an eternal paradise. Those whose hearts are heavy with misdeeds are devoured by Amet, a composite monster, and cease to exist. This system works well for clear cases. Obviously righteous people pass, obviously wicked people fail. But Middle Kingdom theology is grappling with ambiguous cases. What about people who committed grave sins but also performed great services? What about those who violated divine law, but did so under orders from Pharaoh? What about criminals who genuinely repented before death? Traditional theology offers no clear answers. You either pass judgment or you do not. But Amenemhat's priests are developing a new concept: purification through ordeal. The idea that souls too polluted to enter the afterlife directly might be cleansed through suffering that burns away spiritual impurity. If a person could be subjected to enough carefully calibrated torment while alive, perhaps their ka and ba could be purified to the point where they would pass judgment despite their crimes. This concept requires testing. Theory is interesting, but ancient Egyptian religion demands practical demonstration. If purification through ordeal is possible, it must be proven through repeatable procedures that produce observable results. But such tests cannot be conducted in temples where the sun god watches. Ra represents cosmic order and divine law. Experiments that torture people to potentially save their souls exist in theological gray areas that Ra's gaze might interpret as violations of Ma'at rather than as legitimate religious innovation. The solution is to build facilities where these experiments can occur beyond Ra's observation, underground structures. Mazes designed to disorient and terrify and break down normal consciousness, creating conditions where spiritual transformation might occur through geometrically engineered suffering. This is not cruelty for its own sake, but applied theology, testing whether human souls can be refactored through architectural and psychological pressure. Amenemhat commissions the first labyrinth in his 5th year as pharaoh. The commission documents survive in fragmentary form in the Carlsberg Papyri, a collection of Middle Kingdom administrative texts. The documents refer to it euphemistically as the House of Correction, describing it as a facility for the transformation of those who cannot be transformed through conventional means. The initial structure is small, perhaps 30 rooms arranged in a simple grid pattern beneath a warehouse in Memphis. The architect is a priest named Imhotep, not to be confused with the famous Imhotep from the Old Kingdom, but a lesser-known religious official whose name appears in later texts always with the qualifier, who understood necessary geometry. Sources do not explain what necessary geometry means, but archaeological evidence suggests it refers to architectural proportions designed to create specific psychological effects. The first labyrinth is used for approximately 12 people over 3 years. Records do not specify who these people were or what happened to them, but the project is deemed successful enough that Amenemhat orders a larger facility. This second structure, built in his 9th year, contains approximately 150 rooms arranged in a more complex pattern. Passages double back on themselves. Rooms appear identical despite being in different locations. The layout incorporates deliberate confusion. Medical papyri from this period begin to include references to a condition called maze sickness, describing symptoms that modern psychologists would recognize as dissociation and severe anxiety disorder. The texts describe how maze sickness manifests. Patients lose ability to form new memories. They repeat the same actions endlessly without learning from outcomes. They see doors and passages that do not exist. They forget their names, their families, sometimes even that they are human rather than animals. The papyri treat maze sickness as a recognized medical condition requiring treatment, not as a side effect of punishment. This suggests that people were routinely exposed to maze conditions for purposes considered legitimate enough to require medical support. The recommended treatments are interesting. Sunlight for at least 4 hours daily. Social interaction with familiar people. Prohibition from enclosed spaces. Essentially the opposite of maze conditions, recognizing that the damage must be reversed through environmental contrast. By Amenemhat's 15th year, the small experimental labyrinths have proven the concept sufficiently that he commissions the major project, the Great Labyrinth. Contemporary texts refer to it simply as the place in the Fayum where correction occurs beyond observation. Later sources will call it the Labyrinth of Amenemhat. Herodotus, writing 1500 years after its construction, will describe it as more marvelous than the pyramids and more terrible than Hades. The construction project is massive. Texts record that 3,000 workers were employed for 7 years. This workforce is comparable to pyramid construction teams, suggesting similar investment of resources. But unlike pyramids, which are visible monuments asserting pharaonic power, the labyrinth is hidden. Its entrance is unmarked. its location is not included in temple geographies. It exists as a rumor, a whispered threat, a place people know exists but cannot locate. The architectural plans do not survive. Either they were destroyed deliberately, or they were never committed to permanent form. But archaeologists working from Engelbach's original surveys and from modern remote sensing data have reconstructed the basic layout. The labyrinth consists of approximately 3,000 individual chambers arranged across 7 levels, descending 160 feet below the desert surface. The total area is roughly equivalent to 5 football fields. The construction technique is unusual. Most Egyptian underground structures are cut into bedrock, carving chambers directly from stone. The labyrinth is built using a different method. Workers excavated enormous pits in the sand, then constructed limestone walls and ceilings, then backfilled the excavations so the structure was completely buried. This technique required far more labor than simple excavation, but achieved complete concealment. From the surface, nothing indicated the labyrinth's presence except a single disguised entrance. The passages follow no immediately obvious pattern. Some are straight, others curve gradually, a few spiral in ways that make distance perception impossible. Widths vary from 8 feet to less than 3 feet, requiring different postures to navigate. Ceiling heights similarly vary, some chambers tall enough to stand comfortably, others so low that crawling is necessary. This variation is not random, but calculated. Analysis of the measurements shows that they correspond to ratios found in Egyptian musical harmony theory. The labyrinth is architecturally tuned like an instrument. The walls are unnaturally smooth. Egyptian stone carving typically shows tool marks even on the finest surfaces. Labyrinth walls show no marks. Chemical analysis reveals they were finished with a pumice compound that created surfaces so uniform they reflect sound with unusual clarity. This has acoustic implications. In normal buildings, walls absorb some sound and scatter the rest, creating natural damping. Labyrinth walls reflect sound precisely, creating strange echo patterns that make it difficult to determine where sounds originate. The lighting would have been minimal. Egyptian underground structures typically include light shafts or torches positioned at regular intervals. The labyrinth has neither. The only illumination would have come from lamps carried by those moving through the passages. And in a maze, where every passage looks identical, where sounds echo deceptively, where spatial orientation is deliberately undermined, even lamplight becomes unreliable for navigation. But the most disturbing architectural feature is discovered through ground-penetrating radar in 1997. The labyrinth contains false walls, chambers that appear solid but are actually hollow, concealing additional passages that branch from the main route. These hidden passages lead to spaces that are not accessible from the primary labyrinth network. You could map the visible structure completely and still miss entire sections that are architecturally present but geometrically isolated. Why would you build chambers that cannot be reached? The only explanation that makes sense is that the isolation was the point. These were spaces designed to be permanent prisons, rooms where people could be left to die with absolute certainty they would never find an exit, because no exit existed. The passages leading to these isolated chambers were sealed from the outside after victims were placed inside. Radar imaging shows approximately 40 such sealed chambers. Each one contains evidence of human remains. The sealed chambers suggest premeditation at a scale that transforms understanding of the labyrinth's purpose. This was not simply a maze where people might become lost. It was a structure where selected individuals were deliberately isolated in geometrically impossible situations, trapped in spaces that mathematics guaranteed they could never escape, even with perfect knowledge of the full layout. Who were these people? What made them candidates for permanent architectural imprisonment? The answers emerge from analysis of the hieroglyphic inscriptions found throughout the labyrinth, messages carved into walls, in passages both accessible and sealed, communications from people who knew they would die, but wanted to leave some trace of their existence. The inscriptions in Amenemhat's labyrinth are unlike any other corpus of ancient Egyptian writing. Most hieroglyphic texts are formal, following established grammatical and stylistic conventions. Tomb inscriptions praise the deceased. Temple inscriptions honor gods. Administrative documents record transactions. The vocabulary and phrasing are predictable, because Egyptian scribal training emphasized conformity to traditional forms. Labyrinth inscriptions break every rule. They are grammatically irregular, using verb forms that appear nowhere else in the Egyptian language. They switch between first and third person within single sentences. They abandon conventional word order. They incorporate symbols that are not part of the standard hieroglyphic repertoire, personal inventions by people who needed to express concepts for which no established vocabulary existed. The earliest systematic translation was attempted by French Egyptologist Pierre Montet in 1934. Montet had access to rubbings of approximately 200 inscriptions collected by Engelbach's team. He published a preliminary translation in the Journal des Savants that created immediate controversy. Many of the inscriptions described experiences that seemed to be hallucinations. But the hallucinations were consistent across multiple writers who had no contact with each other, as evidenced by their locations in different sealed chambers. One frequently repeated theme involves time distortion. Multiple inscriptions describe the passage of time becoming unreliable. I have been walking 3 days, though my lamp oil suggests 3 hours. Morning and night occur simultaneously in different passages. I carved this inscription yesterday and found it aged by decades. These descriptions could be dismissed as delirium, except that forensic analysis of the inscriptions supports the writer's perceptions. Several inscriptions carved into the same wall show different rates of erosion despite being in identical environmental conditions. Chemical analysis reveals that some carvings have patinas suggesting centuries of exposure, while others on the adjacent surface appear recent. The only explanation is that the inscriptions were indeed created at different times, but not the times the writers believed they were creating them. Something about the labyrinth's environment altered how time was experienced, or how aging processes affected different surfaces. Another common theme is identity dissolution. I no longer remember my name, but I remember that forgetting matters. I am 3 different people in 3 different passages, and none of them are who I was when I entered. My ka has separated from my ba, and they argue about which of them is real. Egyptian theology recognized the soul as multiple components, the ka and ba being 2 of them, but treated them as integrated aspects of a single consciousness. Labyrinth inscriptions describe them as becoming independent entities that could conflict. The most disturbing category of inscriptions describes encounters with the maze itself as a conscious entity. The walls move when I do not look at them. The passages want me to become lost and laugh when I try to remember directions. I met myself in a chamber I have not yet entered. These descriptions suggest profound psychological breakdown, except that some are attributed to people who were architects and surveyors, trained professionals whose spatial reasoning skills were presumably more resilient than average. One particularly detailed inscription was found in a chamber that radar imaging reveals was never sealed. It was written by someone who apparently left the labyrinth alive. The text is 22 lines, carved with unusual precision into a wall near what researchers believe was an exit route. The writer identifies himself as Jehuti-Nacht, a name that appears in administrative records as a treasury official during Amenemhat's 27th year. Jehuti-Nacht's inscription describes being sent into the labyrinth as punishment for embezzlement from royal grain stores. He was stripped of his official seals and forced to enter carrying only a lamp and a single jar of water. He was told that if he found the exit within 3 days, his crime would be forgiven. If he did not emerge, his name would be erased from all records, and his family would forfeit his property. The inscription describes his experience with remarkable coherence, given the circumstances. He entered at dawn and walked for what felt like hours through identical passages. He tried to mark his path using scratches on walls, but quickly realized the scratches were appearing in locations where he had not made them, as though the maze was copying his marks to confuse his navigation system. He encountered other people in the passages. Some were recent entries like himself. Others appeared to have been in the maze for months or years, their clothing rotted, their skin showing signs of extreme malnutrition. He tried to communicate, but found that language had become unreliable. Words he spoke emerged as different words. Simple concepts became impossible to convey. The breakdown of language happened gradually, accelerating the longer he remained in the structure. On what he believed was the second day, though he admitted he could not be certain, he found a chamber containing the bodies of perhaps 30 people. They were not skeletons, but preserved corpses, their tissues mummified by the dry air. What disturbed him was their positions. They were arranged in a circle, all facing inward, their hands reaching toward the center where nothing visible existed. The arrangement suggested ritual, but Jehuti-Nacht recognized no known Egyptian ceremonial pattern. He fled that chamber and continued searching for exit. His lamp oil was running low. His water was nearly gone. He was beginning to experience the psychological effects other inscriptions described. Passages that should lead to new areas instead returned him to locations he had already visited. Doors that appeared open revealed themselves as painted illusions when he approached. He started hearing voices that seemed to come from inside his own skull rather than from external sources. The inscription's final section describes his escape in terms that suggest either luck or divine intervention. He writes that he stopped trying to find the exit and instead attempted to find the deepest point in the maze, reasoning that architectural logic might be inverted here. If conventional navigation led to entrapment, perhaps deliberately moving away from exit would paradoxically lead toward it. This strategy apparently worked. He descended through levels, taking every passage that seemed to lead downward, until he reached a chamber different from all others. It contained a pool of water, which should not exist in a structure built to be completely dry. The water was cold and clear. He drank from it despite fearing it might be poisonous. The inscription claims that immediately upon drinking, his sense of direction clarified. He could perceive the correct path to exit as though it glowed in the darkness. He followed this perception through passages he had traversed multiple times before without recognizing them as exit routes. Within what he estimates as 2 hours, he emerged from the entrance, having survived 3 days in the labyrinth. He carved his inscription near the exit to warn others, then returned to Memphis where he reported to the authorities. His testimony was recorded, but his embezzlement charges were not dropped as promised. Instead, he was reassigned to labor crews in distant quarries, effectively exiled from court. Jehuti-Nacht's account is corroborated by other evidence. His name appears in labor records from stone quarries in Aswan, confirming his exile. More significantly, the pool he describes was discovered by archaeologists in 2003 during exploration of the labyrinth's deepest accessible level. The pool still contains water, fed by an underground spring. Chemical analysis shows the water has unusual mineral content, including compounds that have mild psychoactive properties. Drinking significant quantities could indeed produce altered states of consciousness, but Jehuti-Nacht was exceptional in escaping. Most entries to the labyrinth did not exit. Skeletal analysis of remains found in accessible chambers suggests at least 300 individuals died in the structure over the 70-year period it remained operational. These are only the remains that can be found and counted. The sealed chambers likely contain many more. Who were these people? Demographic analysis provides disturbing answers. Approximately 40% were adult males between 20 and 40 years old. 30% were females in similar age range. 20% were adolescents between 12 and 18. 10% were children younger than 12. This distribution does not match criminal punishment patterns, which would skew heavily toward adult males. The inclusion of significant numbers of women and children suggests the labyrinth's victims were not simply convicted criminals. Analysis of bone isotope ratios, allows researchers to determine where individuals lived during childhood based on minerals incorporated into bones from local water and food. The labyrinth victims show enormous geographic diversity. Some grew up in the Delta region. Others came from southern Egypt near Aswan. Several show isotope signatures consistent with origins in Nubia or the Levant. This geographic spread indicates a systematic collection process, gathering candidates from across Egypt's sphere of influence. Bone pathology reveals that many victims had medical conditions that would have been noticeable to observers. Several skeletons show evidence of healed fractures that had set improperly, creating visible deformities. Others display signs of chronic diseases that would have produced obvious symptoms. Several skulls show cranial abnormalities consistent with conditions that cause developmental disabilities. The presence of visibly disabled or disfigured individuals suggests they were specifically selected. Egyptian cultural attitudes toward disability were complex. Physical perfection was associated with divine favor. Deformity was sometimes interpreted as divine punishment or demonic influence. Middle Kingdom texts occasionally refer to people with disabilities as those bearing visible evidence of Ma'at disruption. This phrasing suggests theological rather than medical interpretation of disability. If physical deformity indicated spiritual corruption, and if the labyrinth was designed to test whether spiritual corruption could be corrected through ordeal, then disabled people would be logical candidates for the experiment. But disability does not explain all victims. Many skeletons show no pathological abnormalities. These were healthy individuals with no visible markers that would distinguish them for selection. The inclusion of apparently normal people alongside disabled victims suggests the selection criteria were more complex than simply gathering those marked by deformity. A partial answer comes from an unexpected source. In 2009, archaeologists excavating an administrative building in Memphis discovered a cache of ostraca, limestone flakes used as scratch paper for temporary records. Among these ostraca were approximately 30. That reference, collection for the Fayum process, listing names and brief descriptions. The lists include categories like barren women over 30, children who speak to spirits, men who refused military service, those who dream of becoming pharaoh, and foreigners who worship false gods. The ostraca reveal that labyrinth candidates were selected based on categories that combined disability, behavioral deviance, political unreliability, and religious nonconformity. The labyrinth was not simply a prison for criminals, but a processing facility for everyone who deviated from social norms in ways that threatened Ma'at. Physical deformity, mental illness, political dissent, religious heterodoxy, sexual deviance, all were classified as forms of corruption requiring correction. The theological logic was consistent with Middle Kingdom religious developments. If Ma'at was universal order encompassing everything from cosmic movements to social hierarchies, then any deviation from normative patterns represented Ma'at disruption. The deviant person was not simply an individual with different characteristics, but a localized infection of chaos that might spread if not contained and corrected. The labyrinth offered a solution that was simultaneously punishment, treatment, and theological experiment. Send the deviant into geometrically engineered chaos. If their essential nature was chaotic, they would perish in an environment matching their corruption. If their nature was actually aligned with Ma'at despite surface appearances, they would navigate chaos and emerge corrected. Either outcome served divine order. Death removed corruption from the world. Survival proved the person's Ma'at alignment and justified their reintegration into society. This framework made the labyrinth self-justifying. Deaths proved corruption. Survivals proved effectiveness. The system could not fail because both outcomes confirmed its premises. And because the labyrinth was hidden, operating in darkness beyond Ra's observation, There was no divine authority who might judge the system itself as a corruption of Ma'at, rather than as its enforcement. If you have made it this far through this disturbing history, and want me to know you are still watching, comment the number 1 below right now. Your engagement helps ensure these hidden histories reach people who need to understand how civilizations rationalize systematic cruelty through religious and architectural frameworks that make abuse seem like divine service. The genius of Amenemhat's labyrinth was not simply that it confused spatial orientation. Any sufficiently complex maze can do that. The labyrinth's sophistication lay in how it systematically dismantled the cognitive tools people use to understand and navigate space. It was engineered cognitive warfare, attacking human spatial reasoning at multiple levels simultaneously. Modern analysis of the layout reveals patterns that would not be fully understood until 20th century psychology developed theories about spatial cognition and memory. The labyrinth's architects somehow intuited or discovered through experimentation principles that contemporary neuroscience confirms about how human brains construct mental maps and how those maps can be disrupted. First principle: landmark recognition. Humans navigate primarily through landmarks, memorable features that distinguish one location from another. We remember, turn right at the building with blue door, rather than proceed 100 meters northeast and turn 90 degrees right. The labyrinth eliminates landmark navigation by making every chamber and passage identical. Walls are smooth limestone without distinguishing features. Chambers are rectangular with the same proportions. Passages meet at right angles. Every location looks like every other location. But more subtly, the passages are designed so that identical locations exist in different parts of the maze. Chamber layout A appears in the eastern section, and again in the western section, and again in the central section. A person who navigates by landmarks will believe they are returning to a known location when they are actually entering a different location that looks identical. Their mental map becomes corrupted, associating single locations with multiple spatial positions. Second principle: path integration. When landmarks are unreliable, humans use path integration, an unconscious calculation of our movements through space. We track how far we have moved and in what directions, maintaining a rough estimate of our position relative to starting point. The labyrinth disrupts path integration through subtle grade changes and curve passages. Most passages are not perfectly straight, but include curves with radii of several hundred feet. These curves are too gradual to notice consciously, but they accumulate. A person walking what they perceive as straight for 200 feet has actually walked a gentle arc that curves them 30 degrees off their intended heading. After several such passages, their internal estimate of direction is completely wrong. Grade changes are similarly subtle. The floor slopes downward at approximately 1 degree, imperceptible to normal walking, but enough that over 100 feet you have descended nearly 2 feet. Multiple passages with unnoticed descents lead to people believing they are on the same level when they have actually descended significantly. Then passages with slight upward grades partially compensate, creating situations where you have walked 1,000 feet and descended 20 feet, but your path integration system suggests you remain at your starting elevation. Third principle: temporal landmarks. When spatial landmarks fail, humans use temporal cues to navigate. I walked for 10 minutes before turning left, so I should walk 10 minutes to return to that turn. The labyrinth attacks temporal navigation through manipulation of environmental cues that the body uses to estimate time passage. Normal environments provide multiple timing cues. Natural light changes throughout the day. Temperature varies. Air quality shifts. Physical fatigue accumulates predictably. The labyrinth eliminates or distorts all of these. No natural light penetrates. Temperature is constant, because underground spaces are thermally stable. Air quality remains consistent due to ventilation shafts that are architecturally invisible but maintain oxygen levels. And the smooth stone floors are easier to walk on than typical ancient surfaces, reducing fatigue accumulation. Without external time cues, humans default to internal biological rhythms. But these rhythms assume normal environmental inputs. In constant darkness, with stable temperature, circadian rhythms drift. Sleep-wake cycles lengthen or shorten unpredictably. Hunger cues become unreliable. The subjective experience of time becomes elastic. Minutes feeling like hours, and hours feeling like minutes. The labyrinth includes additional temporal disruption through acoustic engineering. Those unnaturally smooth walls that reflect sound precisely create echo patterns that interfere with temporal perception. When you speak and immediately hear your voice echo from multiple directions at slightly different delays, your brain struggles to integrate the sensory information. The confusion is subtle but cumulative, adding to the general sense that time is behaving strangely. Fourth principle, social navigation. Humans are social animals who instinctively use others for navigation. We follow crowds, ask directions, share information about routes. The labyrinth accommodates this by allowing multiple people in the structure simultaneously. But the maze's geometry ensures that most encounters are brief and confusing rather than helpful. Passages are narrow enough that two people moving in opposite directions must squeeze past each other, preventing extended conversation. Chambers have multiple entrances, so people entering and exiting rarely see each other long enough to establish communication. The acoustic properties mean voices seem to come from wrong directions, making verbal navigation instructions worse than useless. More insidiously, the labyrinth creates situations where you encounter the same person repeatedly without recognizing them as the same person. You meet a woman in a passage and exchange a few words. 20 minutes later, you meet the same woman in a different passage, but she is wearing different clothing or has adopted a different posture, and you do not recognize her. Or you do recognize her and ask how she got ahead of you, and she insists she has never seen you before. These encounters undermine social trust, making people less likely to cooperate even when cooperation might help. The clothing variation is particularly clever. Analysis of textile fragments found in the labyrinth reveals that spare garments were cached in certain chambers. People who had been in the maze for extended periods would change into these spare garments when their original clothing became too filthy. But because everyone had access to the same cache, multiple people might wear the same garment at different times. You could meet someone wearing the distinctive blue shawl you met yesterday on someone else, creating confusion about whether you are seeing the same person in different clothing or different people in the same clothing. Fifth principle, goal maintenance. Navigating complex spaces requires maintaining focus on the destination. I am looking for the exit. I need to reach the central chamber. The labyrinth undermines goal maintenance through architectural features that create compelling but irrelevant sub-goals. Certain chambers contain painted decorations, showing beautiful gardens and pleasant scenes of daily life. Others have small alcoves with cushions and shade, inviting rest. A few contain interesting objects, pottery or jewelry or small sculptures, that capture attention. These features are not random but strategically placed to distract from the primary goal of navigation. More subtly, the labyrinth includes dead ends that are almost but not quite dead ends. You reach what appears to be a blank wall, but notice a small opening near the floor, too small for adults but accessible to children or to adults willing to crawl. These openings suggest continuation, creating the sub-goal of explore this opening to see where it leads. Following these sub-goals consumes time and energy and moves you away from productive navigation paths. The cumulative effect of these 5 principles is comprehensive spatial confusion. Your landmarks are unreliable. Your path integration is corrupted. Your temporal sense is disrupted. Your social navigation fails. Your goals fragment into irrelevant sub-goals. You are lost in a way that is more profound than simple disorientation. You have lost the cognitive tools that allow humans to construct spatial understanding. But the labyrinth includes one final element that elevates it from merely confusing to actively psychologically destructive: the false exits. Approximately every 200 chambers, you encounter a passage that appears to lead to the surface. The architectural cues are subtle but compelling. The passage slopes upward. Air quality improves. You see natural light, or what appears to be natural light. You follow this passage with growing hope. You are escaping. You are returning to the world. The ordeal is ending. Then the passage terminates in a painted wall, showing the desert landscape. The natural light was lamplight reflected through crystal lenses embedded in the wall. The upward slope was genuine, but led only to a higher level of the maze rather than to the surface. You are still trapped. Your hope transforms into despair more crushing than if you had never hoped. These false exits occur with sufficient frequency that after encountering several, you begin to distrust all signs of escape. Real exit routes become indistinguishable from false ones. People who actually find legitimate exits refuse to believe they are real, convinced they are encountering another deception. They remain in the maze by choice, having lost the ability to recognize genuine escape when it appears. This is the true brilliance of the labyrinth. It does not simply trap your body, it traps your mind's ability to conceive of freedom. The architecture becomes internalized as a psychological prison that persists even when physical escape becomes possible. You carry the maze with you. You become the maze. And this transformation was the entire point of the structure. To understand why Amenemhat's priests believed the labyrinth could purify souls requires understanding Middle Kingdom theological innovations that never became orthodox but influenced Egyptian religious thought for centuries. The ideas emerged from marginal priesthoods, temples, in provincial locations rather than the major cult centers at Memphis or Thebes. These marginal communities developed heterodox ideas that mainstream priesthoods rejected, but that captured the imagination of pharaohs seeking new sources of authority. The core innovation was the concept of recursive judgment. Traditional Egyptian theology held that judgment occurred once in the hall of Ma'at after death. Your heart was weighed. You passed or failed. The outcome was permanent. But marginal theologians asked uncomfortable questions. What if the weighing was close? What if your heart was only slightly heavier than the feather? Did you deserve the same fate as someone whose heart was enormously heavy with obvious crimes? More troubling. What if you committed terrible acts, but did so in service to Pharaoh or gods? Egyptian law held that obedience to legitimate authority was the highest virtue. But what if legitimate authority commanded atrocity? Were you guilty for obedience or guilty for disobedience? Traditional theology struggled to resolve such paradoxes. The recursive judgment solution was elegant. Your heart would be weighed not once, but multiple times through multiple transformations. After the initial weighing showed impurity, you would be subjected to purification that burned away corruption, then weighed again. If still impure, subjected to deeper purification, then weighed again. The process would recurse until either your heart achieved perfect balance or your soul was completely destroyed. This framework was appealing because it maintained divine justice while allowing gradations of outcome. The absolutely righteous passed immediately. The redeemably impure underwent purification and eventually passed. The irredeemably corrupt were destroyed through purification processes that revealed their essential chaos. Every soul received treatment proportional to its nature. Justice prevailed at all levels. But recursive judgment required practical mechanisms. You could not simply theorize about soul purification. You needed to demonstrate it through methods that produced observable evidence of transformation. The Hall of Ma'at was mythological, located in the afterlife beyond empirical investigation. But if purification could begin during life, if living souls could be subjected to transformative ordeal, then the process could be studied and refined. This is where the labyrinth became theological instrument. The maze was not punishment, but experimental apparatus for soul refinement. Its geometry was designed to create specific psychological states that marginalized priesthoods associated with spiritual purification. By forcing people through architectural ordeal, the priesthood could observe how souls responded to systematic pressure. Did they become more chaotic or more ordered? Did suffering elevate or degrade? The priests recorded observations in texts that mostly did not survive, but which are referenced in later documents. One fragmentary papyrus describes observations from the 7th season of labyrinth operations under priest Amenemhat. The text discusses various entry types and their outcomes. Subjects bearing physical deformity showed rapid psychological deterioration, suggesting their visible corruption extended to essential nature. Subjects bearing political crimes showed resistance to maze effects, suggesting corruption of will rather than essence. Subjects bearing religious deviation showed variable responses requiring individualized assessment. These observations treated people as experimental subjects rather than as individuals with inherent worth. The framework was scientific in the ancient sense, attempting to derive general principles from systematic observation, but the science was conducted without any ethical framework that recognized subjects' humanity. They were raw material for theological investigation, their suffering justified by the knowledge gained. The labyrinth's effectiveness as experimental apparatus came from its ability to produce what the priests called controlled soul crisis. In normal life, suffering is chaotic and unstructured. Random misfortunes occur without pattern, but random suffering is not useful for experimental purposes. You need reproducible conditions that can be varied systematically to test hypotheses. The labyrinth provided controlled crisis through its geometry. Every subject entered at the same location. Every subject encountered the same architectural features. The variables were the subjects themselves and their responses. By comparing outcomes across different subject types, priests could draw conclusions about which categories of deviation were corrigible and which were essential corruption. The priests developed a classification system based on labyrinth outcomes. Category 1. Subjects who navigated successfully and emerged within 3 days. These individuals demonstrated that their apparent deviation was superficial. They were to be reintegrated into society with their records cleared. Category 2. Subjects who survived longer than 3 days but eventually emerged. These required probationary monitoring, but were considered potentially redeemable. Category 3. Subjects who survived indefinitely within the maze but never escaped. These were left in place, their suffering considered ongoing purification. Category 4. Subjects who died within 3 days. These were beyond redemption, their deaths confirming essential corruption. The classification system provided apparent objectivity to what was actually systematic abuse. If you survived, you were redeemed. If you died, you were corrupt. The maze could not be wrong because its verdicts were definitionally correct. This tautological structure made the system intellectually bulletproof within its own framework. Records suggest approximately 15% of labyrinth entries achieved Category 1 status. These survivors were documented in what priests called the Registry of Confirmed Purification. Names that appear in this registry subsequently appear in administrative records, with restored positions. A man named Kai entered the labyrinth after accusations of sodomy, emerged after 2 days, and subsequently served as a minor official in the treasury. A woman named Heditet entered after failing to produce children, emerged after 36 hours, and subsequently married a priest. These successful outcomes were publicized to demonstrate the system's legitimacy. Look, the priests could say, the labyrinth does not simply kill. It discriminates between superficial corruption and essential corruption. Those who emerge are proven worthy. The evidence is their survival. Who can argue with that? But the propaganda omitted crucial details. Category 1, survivors often showed signs of severe psychological trauma. Medical texts describe their symptoms using language that modern psychologists recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They experienced nightmares about being trapped in endless, identical passages. They developed spatial anxiety, becoming distressed in enclosed spaces. Many refused to enter buildings with complex layouts, preferring to conduct all activities outdoors regardless of weather. Category 2 survivors, those who took longer than 3 days to emerge, showed even more severe effects. Several are documented as having lost the ability to speak coherently, their language reduced to repeated fragments that made no sense to listeners. Others developed what medical texts called the maze walk, a shuffling gait with frequent direction changes as though navigating invisible obstacles. A few attacked family members who tried to help them, apparently unable to recognize familiar faces. Category 3 subjects, left to die in the maze, received no documentation beyond registry entries recording their names and entry dates. Their families were told that purification was ongoing, that emergence remained possible, that hope should be maintained. Years might pass. Families would inquire about loved ones. Priests would repeat that purification continues, that patience is required, that divine processes cannot be rushed. Eventually, families stopped inquiring. Names were forgotten. Individuals disappeared into the architectural void. Category 4 subjects, those who died quickly, were declared officially corrupt with their names stricken from all records. Families could not mourn them publicly because mourning acknowledged relationship to corruption. Property was confiscated. Children were sometimes reassigned to other families to prevent corrupting influence from spreading generationally. The theology required that corruption be completely excised, leaving no trace that might resurrect its influence. The theological framework created perfect psychological control. Threat of the labyrinth enforced conformity across Egyptian society. Physical deformity, mental illness, political dissent, religious heterodoxy, all categories the system classified as corruption, could result in labyrinth entry. And once entered, your fate depended not on facts about your character, but on whether you randomly managed to navigate impossible geometry. Fear was the point. The labyrinth's existence as whispered threat was more effective than its actual operations. Most people never entered, but everyone knew about it. Everyone knew someone whose relative had disappeared into correction. Everyone modified their behavior to avoid categories that triggered selection. The panopticon effect of mass surveillance was achieved through architectural threat rather than through actual observation. Middle Kingdom Egypt was, in many ways, a golden age of culture and prosperity. But underneath the civilization's achievements existed this machinery of theological terror, operating in darkness beyond Ra's gaze, processing thousands of people through geometrically engineered suffering in service of ideas about soul purification that mainstream theology rejected, but that pharaonic authority endorsed because the system produced compliance through fear. The labyrinth operated for approximately 70 years, from Amenemhat II's 5th year through Amenemhat III's reign. Then it stopped. The entrance was sealed. The registry of confirmed purification was archived. References to maze operations disappeared from administrative texts. For reasons that remain unclear, the theological experiment was terminated. The most likely explanation is that costs exceeded benefits. The labyrinth required maintaining priesthoods who supervised operations, workers who maintained the structure, physicians who treated survivors. These costs were justified while the system served its deterrent function. But by Amenemhat III's middle years, alternative control mechanisms had developed. Stronger administrative bureaucracy, more effective military, improved agricultural surplus that reduced social tensions. The expensive theological machinery became less necessary. Or perhaps something went wrong that convinced authorities to shut down operations. Fragmentary references suggest events during the 29th season that are not further specified but which coincide chronologically with the cessation of labyrinth activities, possibly a mass escape, possibly a structural failure, possibly something that occurred within the maze that frightened even the priests who operated it. The documentation that would clarify has either been destroyed or remains undiscovered. Whatever the cause, the labyrinth was abandoned. Sand filled the passages over decades. The structure was forgotten by everyone except Fayum locals, whose oral traditions preserved memory of something terrible buried beneath their land. And there it remained undisturbed for nearly 4,000 years, until British archaeologists arrived with the confidence that ancient civilizations held no secrets capable of disturbing modern rationality. Reginald Engelbach did not intend to discover Amenemhat's labyrinth. His expedition was focused on mapping Middle Kingdom settlement patterns in the Fayum region. The area was known to contain archaeological material, but had been lightly investigated compared to more famous sites near Luxor and Giza. Engelbach expected to find the remains of granaries, administrative buildings, perhaps a minor temple. He did not expect to break through into something that would change his life and his understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization. The discovery occurred accidentally. Engelbach's team was trenching across what surface surveys suggested was an ancient foundation. The trench reached 16 feet when a worker's shovel broke through into a void. The sudden collapse created an opening perhaps 3 feet wide. Engelbach descended on a rope to investigate. His carbide lamp revealed a passage extending beyond the lamp's range, walls covered in hieroglyphics, air that smelled of nothing because it had been sealed for millennia. Engelbach's first instinct was excitement. An intact underground structure was extraordinarily rare. Most had been looted in antiquity or damaged by groundwater. An undisturbed site could contain artifacts and inscriptions providing unprecedented insight into Middle Kingdom culture. He shouted to his team to secure the opening and prepare for systematic exploration. Over the next 3 days, Engelbach and 5 team members conducted preliminary surveys of the accessible passages. They mapped approximately 200 chambers, photographed inscriptions, collected samples of pottery and textile fragments found on chamber floors. They discovered skeletal remains in several locations, raising questions about who these people had been and why they died here. The sheer scale of the complex became apparent. This was not a minor structure, but a major installation that had somehow vanished from historical memory. On the 4th day, Engelbach decided to conduct deeper exploration to determine the structure's full extent. He and an Egyptian foreman named Hassan entered the passages carrying 3 days of supplies, including water, food, rope, chalk for marking walls, and multiple lamps with spare oil. They planned to push deeper into the complex, marking their route, returning within 48 hours with better understanding of the layout. They became lost within 6 hours. Engelbach's field notes, recovered later, described the experience with increasing desperation. They followed passages that curved gradually, always maintaining rope contact with their starting point. But when they attempted to return by following the rope back, they discovered it led to a chamber they had not visited before. Engelbach hypothesized that the rope had been moved by someone or something. Hassan suggested the maze was active, a living entity that changed its configuration. They attempted to navigate by marking walls with chalk arrows, but the chalk marks appeared to multiply, appearing on walls where neither man had drawn them. Some arrows pointed in contradictory directions. Others formed patterns that looked like letters in a language neither man recognized. The notes suggest both men were struggling to maintain rational thought against mounting psychological pressure. Engelbach's notes break off mid-sentence on what he believed was the 2nd day. The next entry is in different handwriting, Hassan's rather than Engelbach's. Hassan writes in Arabic rather than English. He describes Engelbach sitting motionless in a chamber, staring at a wall, unresponsive to Hassan's attempts to rouse him. Hassan says he carried Engelbach for what felt like endless hours through passages that seemed designed to prevent exit. He hallucinated multiple times, seeing his deceased father, seeing his childhood home, seeing things that should not exist in underground spaces. The notes end with Hassan writing that he sees light ahead, that he is certain this is the exit, that he is terrified. The light is another deception, but must follow it because all other options have failed. These are the last words in Engelbach's recovered notebook. Engelbach and Hassan emerged from the labyrinth entrance 72 hours after entry. Workers who had remained at the surface reported that the two men appeared disoriented and traumatized. Engelbach was unable to speak coherently for 6 hours. Hassan refused to discuss what they had experienced. Both men showed signs of dehydration and physical exhaustion, despite having adequate supplies. The Egyptian Antiquities Service was immediately notified of the discovery. Officials arrived within 2 days and conducted their own brief survey. They found the structure to be both archaeologically significant and potentially dangerous. The combination prompted an unusual decision. The entrance would be resealed. Limited excavation would continue under strict controlled access. Information about the site would be restricted to prevent looting and sensationalist attention. Engelbach protested the restrictions. He argued that the labyrinth represented unprecedented opportunity for understanding Middle Kingdom culture. Sealing it without comprehensive documentation was scientific vandalism. But his protests were overruled by Egyptian authorities, who had their own reasons for limiting access. The Antiquities Service was under British administrative control but staffed by Egyptian scholars who understood their cultural heritage in ways British archaeologists did not. They recognized that the labyrinth was not simply archaeological site, but active cultural wound, something that Egyptian tradition had deliberately forgotten for good reason. Engelbach was permitted to continue analysis of materials collected during initial exploration, but was prohibited from returning to the site. His published articles about the discovery were carefully worded to emphasize architectural interest, while minimizing description of disturbing features. Inscriptions describing the maze's psychological effects were translated but not widely circulated. Skeletal remains were catalogued, but not analyzed in detail. The labyrinth became an obscure footnote in Egyptological literature, mentioned occasionally but not studied comprehensively. Engelbach himself was permanently affected by the experience. Colleagues reported personality changes. He became withdrawn, avoiding social interaction. He developed insomnia, often working through nights because sleep brought nightmares about being trapped in identical limestone passages. He repeatedly drew maze patterns in the margins of his notebooks, geometries that became increasingly complex and alien to classical Egyptian architectural forms. In 1931, 9 years after the discovery, Engelbach was found dead in his office at the Cairo Museum. The official cause was heart failure. He was 53 years old, not young but not elderly. Medical examination found no obvious cardiac pathology. Some colleagues whispered that he had died of maze sickness, that his brief exposure to the labyrinth had created psychological damage that slowly destroyed him over years. Hassan, the foreman who accompanied Engelbach into the maze, returned to his village near Fayum after the incident. His family reported that he was changed. He prayed more frequently and with greater intensity. He refused to discuss his work with the archaeological team. He would not answer questions about what he and Engelbach had experienced. 20 years later, in 1942, Hassan broke his silence in conversation with his grandson. The grandson, interviewed by researchers in 1998, recalled Hassan's words with remarkable clarity. Hassan said the maze was not simply architecture, but theology made physical, an attempt to build the underworld and force living people to navigate what should only be traversed after death. He said the maze succeeded too well, becoming a genuine liminal space where normal rules of reality did not apply. He said he believed some people never truly escape even when their bodies leave, that part of them remains trapped in the passages continuing to search for exit that recedes with every turn. These stories might be dismissed as trauma responses, except that other researchers who entered the labyrinth in later decades reported similar experiences. In 1967, a team from Cambridge University conducted archaeological surveys using newly developed surveying equipment. They spent 3 days in the accessible sections mapping the layout. 2 team members subsequently required psychiatric treatment for anxiety disorders. The team leader reported persistent spatial disorientation that made driving dangerous. All three withdrew from Egyptian archaeology and redirected their careers to classical Mediterranean studies. In 1985, a French-Egyptian team attempted comprehensive mapping using laser distance measurement and computer modeling. They spent 6 weeks in the structure working in shifts, never entering alone, always maintaining radio contact with surface support. Their final report noted unusual equipment failures, distance measurements that contradicted themselves, mapping data that generated impossible geometries when processed. One team member disappeared for 14 hours despite never being out of radio contact, insisting she had been present all along, while other team members insisted she vanished. These repeated problems led to growing consensus that the labyrinth should remain closed to researchers except under extraordinary circumstances. The scientific value of access was outweighed by demonstrated psychological risks. By 1990, the entrance had been sealed with concrete, and the surface location was no longer marked on archaeological maps. The few scholars aware of the site's existence treated it as cautionary tale about the limits of archaeological investigation. Some sites are better left sealed, but technology continued advancing. In 1997, a research team proposed using ground-penetrating radar to survey the labyrinth without physical entry. The Egyptian Antiquities Authority approved the non-invasive study. GPR units were positioned at multiple surface locations around the estimated labyrinth perimeter. The resulting data produced the most comprehensive mapping of the structure ever achieved. The GPR results revealed that the labyrinth was far larger than physical exploration had suggested. The accessible passages represented perhaps 20% of the total structure. The remaining 80% existed as sealed chambers, isolated sections, spaces that were architecturally present but geometrically unreachable. The full extent covered approximately 40 acres and descended more than 160 feet, making it one of the largest underground complexes in the ancient world. More disturbing, the GPR data showed anomalies that the survey team struggled to explain. Certain chambers appeared to move between scan sessions conducted hours apart. Passages that showed clear GPR signatures in one scan disappeared in subsequent scans. Some sections produced radar reflections, suggesting the presence of water despite being well above the water table. The anomalies might be equipment artifacts or might indicate that the labyrinth's strange properties extended to how it interacted with electromagnetic radiation. The 1997 survey team published their findings with careful caveats about interpretation. They acknowledged that the structure was architecturally remarkable, but stopped short of speculating about its purpose, beyond vague reference to possible ceremonial function. Only in private conversations did team members admit their discomfort with the data, their sense that something about the structure was fundamentally wrong in ways that conventional archaeology could not adequately address. Since 1997, the labyrinth has remained closed. Occasional proposals for further investigation are submitted and rejected. The Egyptian government's position is that the site is adequately documented for current scholarly purposes and that invasive study would risk damage to fragile ancient structures. But sources close to the Antiquities Authority suggest the real reason is different. The government is quietly concerned that the labyrinth remains dangerous, that whatever psychological effects it was designed to produce continue to function 4,000 years after construction, that modern understanding of ancient Egyptian architecture is insufficient to safely interact with structures built according to theological principles we cannot reconstruct. The labyrinth of Amenemhat remains one of ancient Egypt's most significant unsolved mysteries. Despite a century of investigation, fundamental questions have no satisfactory answers. The structure exists, its basic layout is mapped, its historical context is understood, but understanding what it truly was and how it functioned requires grappling with possibilities that challenge modern assumptions about ancient capabilities. First question: how did Middle Kingdom architects develop principles of psychological manipulation through geometry? The labyrinth's design incorporates concepts about spatial cognition and memory that were not formally understood by Western psychology until the 20th century. How did ancient builders discover that gradual curves disrupt path integration? How did they learn that identical repeated environments confuse landmark navigation? How did they determine optimal passage widths for inducing claustrophobia without triggering immediate panic? One possibility is empirical discovery through iteration. Build a small maze. Observe how people navigate it. Modify the design. Observe again. Repeat for years or decades, gradually developing architectural patterns that produce desired psychological effects without understanding the underlying mechanisms. Ancient Egyptian civilization was extraordinarily conservative, preserving and refining traditional knowledge over millennia. A sufficiently motivated priesthood with adequate resources could have accumulated practical knowledge about maze psychology through generations of experimentation. But this explanation requires assuming the experimental program ran for considerable time before Amenemhat's major construction project. Where are the smaller experimental mazes? No such structures have been discovered. Either they were destroyed so thoroughly that no archaeological traces remain, or they were never built, and the psychological principles were developed through theoretical insight rather than empirical discovery. Both options are troubling. Perfect destruction suggests systematic erasure. Theoretical insight suggests knowledge sources we do not recognize. Second question. What was the role of the underground water source? The pool that Jehuti Nach described and that archaeologists confirmed exists in the deepest accessible chamber is anomalous. Underground water in this location should not exist. The labyrinth is built in sand and limestone above the regional water table. Yet, clear water flows from somewhere, collected in a pool that was apparently incorporated into the original architectural design rather than resulting from later seepage. Chemical analysis of the water shows unusual mineral content, including mild, psychoactive compounds. Drinking the water would produce subtle alterations in consciousness, particularly in perception of space and time. Was the water naturally psychoactive, and the labyrinth was built around this natural feature? Or was the water artificially treated with compounds derived from plants or minerals? If the water was natural, it suggests the Fayum location was selected specifically because this psychoactive spring existed here. Geological surveys might reveal whether similar springs exist elsewhere in Egypt, possibly explaining locations of other maze structures that were reportedly built but have never been found. If the water was artificial, it demonstrates sophisticated pharmacological knowledge beyond what is generally attributed to Middle Kingdom medicine. The pool's positioning at the labyrinth's deepest point suggests theological significance. In Egyptian cosmology, underground spaces are associated with the underworld, the realm of Osiris and the dead. A pool at the lowest point might represent symbolic connection to Nun, the primordial waters from which creation emerged. Drinking from such waters could be interpreted as spiritual rebirth, returning to the source and being remade. But why would maze architects include potential escape mechanism in a structure designed to trap and disorient? Perhaps the pool was not escape mechanism, but final test. Only those who achieved sufficient psychological transformation to abandon conventional navigation logic would think to descend rather than ascend. Only those who had truly surrendered their preconceptions would recognize that drinking strange water in an underground pool might be path to enlightenment rather than path to poisoning. The pool separated those who clung to rational analysis from those who accepted irrational faith. Third question. What happened to the isolated chambers? The sealed sections revealed by GPR contain human remains, approximately 40 individuals trapped in geometrically unreachable spaces. Why isolate these particular people? What distinguished them from those placed in the main labyrinth? One possibility is that the isolated chambers held particularly dangerous individuals, political threats who could not be publicly executed, religious dissidents whose ideas were too compelling to refute through argument, foreigners who possessed valuable knowledge that Egyptian authorities wanted to suppress. Permanent architectural imprisonment ensured these individuals could never communicate their dangerous knowledge while avoiding the martyrdom that public execution might create. Another possibility is that isolated chambers were final destination for those who survived labyrinth entry, but achieved wrong type of transformation. Perhaps some people navigated the maze successfully, but emerged changed in ways that priests found theologically troubling. Rather than releasing dangerous anomalies or killing them outright, authorities moved them to sealed spaces where they would eventually die while contained. This would explain skeletal evidence suggesting isolated chamber victims survived for extended periods, consuming whatever food and water they had, while slowly dying of thirst and starvation in geometrically perfect prisons. A third possibility, more disturbing, is that isolated chambers were long-term storage for living experimental subjects. Keep them sealed for months or years, monitoring them through observation holes or hidden passages, studying how extended isolation affects human psychology. This explanation requires assuming architectural features we have not discovered, hidden routes allowing access to supposedly sealed chambers. But GPR cannot necessarily distinguish between truly sealed chambers and chambers with small access tunnels that are architecturally present, but too narrow to show clearly in radar returns. Fourth question: why did the labyrinth operations cease? The sudden termination of a major theological program after 70 years demands explanation. Programs that run for 7 decades develop institutional momentum that resists termination. The priesthoods operating the labyrinth had established authority, allocated resources, trained personnel. Why abandon such investment? The timing coincides with religious reforms implemented during Amenemhat III's later reign. These reforms consolidated power in major cult centers while reducing authority of provincial priesthoods. The marginal theologies that justified labyrinth operations may have lost political support, but this explanation is incomplete because it describes political circumstances without explaining what specifically triggered the decision to seal rather than transfer control to different priesthood. Historical sources mention the Fayoum incident, in contexts suggesting contemporary readers understood the reference, but without providing explanation for modern historians. The Westcar Papyrus, a collection of stories about magical events, includes cryptic reference to those who sought to enter the underworld before their time and found the underworld unwilling to release them. This phrasing might be metaphorical or might be veiled description of something that went catastrophically wrong in labyrinth operations. The most intriguing possibility is that someone escaped who should not have escaped, someone with knowledge or capabilities that threatened the entire system. Perhaps a political prisoner who emerged psychologically intact and publicly described labyrinth operations, creating scandal that could not be contained. Perhaps a priest who entered the maze as part of maintenance operations and emerged transformed in ways that undermined theological justifications for the structure's existence. Perhaps something emerged that was not human, if we credit the most extreme versions of local folklore. Fifth question: what remains unknown about the structure's full extent? GPR mapping reveals the labyrinth's outline, but cannot show detailed internal architecture of sealed sections. We know approximately how much space exists. We do not know how that space is organized or what it contains. The sealed chambers might hold artifacts, inscriptions, architectural features that would revolutionize understanding of Middle Kingdom culture. They might hold nothing of interest, empty rooms that were sealed simply to prevent future access. They might hold things that would be better left undiscovered. The risk-benefit calculation for opening sealed sections is genuinely difficult. On one hand, archaeological ethics suggest we should document and preserve cultural heritage. The labyrinth is a significant historical structure that deserves comprehensive study. Future technologies might provide safer methods for exploration than were available to Engelbach or subsequent researchers. We might miss critical insights if we permanently seal the site without exhausting investigative possibilities. On the other hand, a century of investigation has demonstrated that the labyrinth produces consistent negative psychological effects on people who enter it. These effects persist despite modern understanding of psychology, and despite precautions like radio communication and strict time limits. Whatever properties make the structure dangerous were engineered into its architecture and remain functional millennia after construction. We do not understand these properties well enough to safely neutralize them. Opening sealed sections might expose researchers to intensified versions of effects that have already caused trauma and death. The question ultimately is whether understanding ancient cruelty is worth risking modern suffering. Is historical knowledge valuable enough to justify exposing archaeologists to systems designed to break human minds? The academic answer is yes. Knowledge is always worth pursuing. The ethical answer is more complex. Knowledge gained through harm is knowledge that carries moral debt. Researchers who enter knowing the risks assume personal responsibility, but institutions that send researchers into documented danger carry institutional responsibility that extends beyond individual consent. Currently, the Egyptian government's position is that sealed sections will remain sealed pending development of exploration methods that demonstrate safety beyond current capabilities. This position is simultaneously conservative and reasonable. It acknowledges the structure's significance while recognizing that some ancient technologies may exceed our capacity to safely reverse engineer. It is also conveniently unprovable, since no exploration method can demonstrate safety until tested, and testing requires the very access that is being denied. Sixth question. Were there other labyrinths? Multiple sources reference maze-like structures in ancient Egypt, but few have been conclusively identified. Herodotus described a labyrinth near Lake Moeris that he considered more impressive than the pyramids. His description matches the general location of Amenemhat's confirmed structure, suggesting he visited the same site or a closely related one. But he described it as still operational in the 5th century before the Common Era, more than 1,000 years after Middle Kingdom construction. Either he was describing a site that had been reopened, or there were multiple labyrinth structures that operated at different times. The Hermetic texts, esoteric writings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus but actually composed in Greco-Roman Egypt, include descriptions of underground initiation chambers, where candidates for mystery cult membership were tested through ordeal. The descriptions emphasize disorientation, psychological pressure, and transformation through suffering. These might be cultural memory of labyrinth practices, preserved in mystery traditions long after the original structures were sealed. Archaeological surveys in the Nile Delta have identified anomalous underground voids that GPR suggests are architecturally structured rather than natural cavities. Some researchers speculate these might be additional maze complexes built during Middle Kingdom, but subsequently destroyed or buried beyond easy identification. Excavating these sites to confirm speculation would require massive investment without guarantee of significant finds. Egyptian archaeological resources are limited and must be allocated to projects with clearer expected returns. The possibility of multiple labyrinths is tantalizing because if several structures existed, comparative analysis might reveal design principles that single site cannot show. Differences in layout or operation might indicate evolution of architectural techniques over time. Similarities would confirm that labyrinth psychology was systematic knowledge rather than accidental discovery. But without confirmed additional sites, speculation remains speculation. Seventh question. How should modern Egypt and modern archaeology relate to this history? The labyrinth represents civilization's capacity for systematic cruelty dressed in theological justification. It was built by ancestors of contemporary Egyptians, but embodied ideas that contemporary Egyptian culture rejects. How should modern Egyptians understand and present this heritage? Some argue the labyrinth should be opened fully and presented as educational site, show people what ancient systematic abuse looked like, use it as monument to victims who died there. Create museum explaining theological context and architectural techniques. Make the horror visible so it cannot be repeated. This approach treats the structure as historical artifact that should be preserved and interpreted like any other site of cultural significance. Others argue the labyrinth should remain sealed and unmarked. Let it stay buried, known only to specialists, removed from public awareness, arguing that some historical truths do more harm than good. That widely publicizing sophisticated ancient methods for psychological torture risks inspiring modern replications. That the site itself may remain dangerous and should not become tourist attraction where people expose themselves to documented psychological risks. A third position argues for documentation without preservation. Map everything with remote sensing, photograph and scan accessible sections, then deliberately destroy the structure, filling it with concrete so it can never be entered again. Preserve the knowledge while eliminating the dangerous artifact. This approach is controversial because it violates archaeological ethics about preservation, but it treats the labyrinth as active weapon rather than as passive monument. These debates are not abstract. The Egyptian Antiquities Authority must make practical decisions about the site's management, budget allocations, access policies, whether to publicize or obscure the location, how to respond to research proposals. Each decision reflects underlying assumptions about what the labyrinth represents and how contemporary society should relate to disturbing heritage. Currently, the compromise position holds. The site exists, is documented, is studied by specialists, but is not publicized or made accessible to general researchers or public. This maximizes knowledge preservation while minimizing exposure to documented risks. It is unsatisfying compromise that resolves tensions without actually resolving underlying disagreements. But perhaps unsatisfying compromise is appropriate response to heritage that combines architectural brilliance with theological horror. The labyrinth of Amenemhat matters beyond its specific historical context because it reveals capabilities and inclinations that challenge comfortable assumptions about ancient civilizations. We prefer to imagine ancient peoples as either noble savages living in harmony with nature, or as naive primitives lacking knowledge that modernity has achieved. The labyrinth fits neither narrative. The structure demonstrates sophisticated understanding of human psychology applied deliberately to create suffering. This is not primitive ignorance, but advanced knowledge used for purposes we find morally repugnant. It suggests that intelligence and technical capability are independent from ethics, that societies can be simultaneously advanced in some domains while barbaric in others, that progress in knowledge does not guarantee progress in wisdom. Modern parallels are uncomfortable, but unavoidable. Contemporary societies have developed technologies for psychological manipulation and control that ancient Egyptians would recognize as refinements of principles they pioneered. Prison architecture designed to prevent human contact and induce psychological breakdown. Enhanced interrogation techniques using disorientation and sensory manipulation. Social isolation as punishment. Indefinite detention in spaces designed to erase time sense. These modern practices share conceptual DNA with labyrinth's engineered cruelty. The difference is that modern practices are theoretically governed by laws and ethics that recognize human rights. Theoretically, in practice, the same justifications that priests use to defend labyrinth operations appear in modern form. National security requires harsh measures. Dangerous individuals forfeit normal protections. Scientific knowledge gained through morally questionable methods is still knowledge. The needs of society outweigh the suffering of individuals. Every justification for ancient horror has modern equivalent. This recognition is crucial because it undermines self-congratulatory narratives about moral progress. We are not necessarily more ethical than ancient Egyptians. We have different technologies and different justifications, but similar capacities for rationalized cruelty. The labyrinth is not just ancient history, but mirror showing us possibilities that remain active in human culture. The structure also demonstrates something disturbing about architecture's potential. Buildings shape human experience in ways that architects intend and in ways they do not intend. Spaces create moods, influence behaviors, frame possibilities. Usually, these effects are subtle. A well-designed room makes people feel comfortable. Poor layout creates frustration. But the labyrinth reveals that architecture can be weaponized, that spaces can be designed specifically to damage human psychology, that geometry can be methodology for erasing minds. This recognition raises questions about contemporary architecture. To what extent are modern spaces optimized for human flourishing versus optimized for control? Office buildings designed to minimize worker autonomy. Housing projects that isolate rather than create community. Public spaces configured to discourage homeless people from occupying them. Shopping centers engineered to maximize consumption. None of these are labyrinths, but all share the principle of using architectural design to manipulate behavior and experience. The difference is one of degree and intention. Modern architecture rarely aims to traumatize, but it frequently aims to control, and control implemented through environmental design operates below conscious awareness in ways that make resistance difficult. We cannot opt out of being influenced by spaces we occupy. The labyrinth's lesson is that this susceptibility can be exploited by those who understand how environments shape consciousness. The theological dimension adds another layer of concern. The labyrinth was built to serve religious goals that priests genuinely believed were righteous. They were not sadists enjoying torture. They were believers implementing what their theology required. The suffering they inflicted was systematized through intellectual frameworks that made cruelty seem like divine service. This is more frightening than simple sadism, because it reveals how institutions can convince intelligent people that harm is good. Modern equivalents appear in any context where ideology overrides individual welfare, political movements that sacrifice people to historical necessity, economic systems that accept casualties as unavoidable costs, medical experiments that weigh knowledge gained against subjects harmed. Whenever abstract principles are prioritized over concrete human suffering, the labyrinth's legacy is active. The specific theology changes, but the structure of justification remains consistent. Understanding this pattern is essential for recognizing when it appears in contemporary contexts. The warning signs are predictable. First, define a category of people as threats to cosmic order, whether divine ma'at or national security or public health or market efficiency. Second, develop technologies or procedures for managing these threatening people, justified by the threat they supposedly pose. Third, implement the management system in spaces hidden from public view or public understanding. Fourth, classify outcomes so failures are invisible while successes are publicized. Fifth, respond to criticism by invoking necessity and challenging critics' loyalty to the values the system supposedly protects. This pattern has appeared repeatedly throughout human history, in contexts ranging from ancient Egyptian labyrinths to medieval inquisitions to modern totalitarian states. The specifics vary, but the template persists because it works. Fear is effective motivator. Classification systems create apparent objectivity. Hidden operations prevent sympathy from developing. The combination produces compliance from majority, while systematically destroying minorities classified as threats. Breaking the pattern requires specific kinds of resistance. Refusing to accept that any category of people deserves treatment that would be considered cruel if applied to ourselves. Insisting on transparency in how systems operate rather than accepting claims that secrecy is necessary. Questioning whether outcomes justify methods rather than assuming institutional authority has performed adequate ethical analysis. Extending empathy to those classified as threats, despite propaganda aimed at dehumanizing them. Recognizing that technologies of control are never neutral regardless of claims that they are just tools whose morality depends on use. The labyrinth's specific legacy also includes influencing subsequent architectural and cultural developments. Greco-Roman mystery cults incorporated maze symbolism into initiation rites. though usually in symbolic rather than literal architectural form. Medieval churches occasionally included labyrinth patterns in floor tiles, representing spiritual journey, but in safely two-dimensional form. Renaissance gardens featured maze structures designed for entertainment rather than torture, domesticating ancient terror into aristocratic amusement. These echoes suggest labyrinth archetype retained cultural power long after original structures were sealed. The maze, as symbol for confusion, for test, for transformation through trial, persists across cultures. But the symbol has been sanitized, stripped of the horror that original labyrinths embodied. Architectural mazes become puzzles to solve rather than systems designed to break consciousness. The cultural memory preserves form while forgetting function. This amnesia is dangerous because it allows each generation to rediscover cruelty as though it were innovation rather than recognizing it as repetition of ancient patterns. If we understood that geometrically engineered psychological torture was perfected 4,000 years ago, we might be more resistant to modern proposals that employ similar principles. But because the historical knowledge is obscure, available only to specialists in ancient Egyptian architecture, each generation treats its own cruelty as unprecedented. Recovering this history is therefore not just archaeological curiosity, but ethical necessity. We need to understand what humans have done to humans, not to cultivate guilt or despair, but to develop recognition that prevents repetition. The labyrinth of Amenemhat is one example among many, but it is a particularly clear example because the structure still exists, can still be studied, still produces measurable psychological effects. It is not metaphor or legend, but physical reality, architectural proof of ancient systematic abuse. Reginald Engelbach died in 1931, 9 years after discovering the labyrinth. The official cause was heart failure, but colleagues whispered about maze sickness, about psychological damage that accumulated over years until it became physically lethal. We cannot know whether the maze killed him, but we know it changed him. That brief exposure to architectural horror left permanent marks that shaped his remaining years. His final journal entry, written the night before his death, describes a recurring dream. He is walking through passages that are simultaneously the labyrinth and every corridor he has ever traversed. Museums, hotels, city streets, all revealed as variations on the same fundamental geometry. He writes that he has come to believe the labyrinth was never just building but idea, and that ideas can infect minds as viruses infect bodies. Once you have encountered the maze, once you have walked its passages and felt its effects, you carry it with you forever. This metaphor is more than poetic fancy. Recent psychological research on trauma confirms that extreme experiences create permanent neural changes. Brains exposed to prolonged stress develop different connection patterns, different baseline anxiety levels, different ways of processing spatial information. Trauma literally rewires consciousness. And if trauma is architectural, if it is deliberately engineered through environmental design, then the engineering persists as psychological structure long after the physical structure is left behind. This means the labyrinth's victims carried it within them, mental mazes that continued to confuse and trap even after bodies escaped limestone passages. And this means Engelbach's exposure, brief though it was, installed maze geometry into his cognitive architecture. He became partially labyrinthine, his mind incorporating patterns that undermined its own stability. This is the labyrinth's ultimate horror. It does not simply trap bodies. It propagates itself, turning victims into carriers who spread the architectural infection to new locations and new times. The structure beneath the Fayum Desert is sealed, its passages filled with sand, its entrance concealed. But the maze itself remains active in cultural memory, in architectural practice, in psychological trauma that descendants of victims may carry through genetic or cultural transmission of suffering. Every time someone designs a building meant to confuse or control, the labyrinth's influence persists. Every time psychological torture is rationalized through reference to greater goods, the theological framework that justified Amenemhat's construction reasserts itself. We cannot destroy the labyrinth because we cannot destroy knowledge. Even filling the structure with concrete would not eliminate understanding that such structures are possible, that human psychology can be weaponized through geometry, that suffering can be systematized through architectural precision. Once known, this knowledge persists, waiting for circumstances that might justify its application. The only protection is ethical vigilance, sustained refusal to accept that cruelty can ever be made righteous through clever justification. The labyrinth of Amenemhat remains one of ancient Egypt's darkest secrets, literally and metaphorically dark, built in sunless depths to hide operations that theology could not justify in Ra's sight. For 4,000 years it was successfully hidden, known only through fragmentary references and whispered stories. Engelbach's discovery brought it back into historical consciousness, forcing us to acknowledge that golden ages can have shadows, that civilizations we admire can also appall us. This knowledge is uncomfortable, but necessary. We must understand that humans have always possessed capacity for systematic cruelty, that intelligence enables rather than prevents atrocity, that religious and political institutions can rationalize any abuse through sufficiently elaborate justification. The labyrinth teaches these lessons through architecture that still exists, still functions, still demonstrates ancient capabilities that modernity has not surpassed. If you found this exploration of forbidden history compelling and disturbing, hit that subscribe button right now. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand how civilizations hide systematic abuse through architectural and institutional secrecy. Comment below telling me what other ancient mysteries deserve investigation. What other secrets have been buried too successfully? These stories matter because they reveal patterns that persist across millennia. The technologies change, but the template remains constant. Understanding ancient horrors helps us recognize when contemporary societies follow similar paths. The labyrinth is not just history, but warning, not just monument, but mirror, not just structure, but shadow that continues to shape how we build and how we justify what we build. Amenemhat's maze is sealed beneath desert sand, its passages dark, its victims silent. But the questions it raises remain urgent. What are we building now that future generations will discover and struggle to comprehend? What structures of control are we constructing that seem righteous, but which history will judge as atrocities? What justifications are we accepting that echo theological certainties of ancient priests who believed suffering could purify souls? The maze we carry is not just Amenemhat's limestone passages, but our own capacity for rationalized cruelty, our susceptibility to institutional justifications, our willingness to classify some people as threats who deserve special treatment beyond normal ethics. This maze exists in every human society, dormant until circumstances activate it. Understanding the ancient architectural maze helps us recognize the psychological maze, makes us more resistant to geometries of control that promise security through systematic dehumanization. The darkness beneath the Fayum desert holds secrets we have only partially recovered. The full truth remains sealed in chambers we cannot reach, inscribed on walls we cannot read, embodied in architecture we cannot safely explore. Perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps some knowledge should remain buried because knowing encourages replication. Or perhaps the only protection against repetition is complete understanding, comprehensive documentation that makes clear exactly what was done and why it must never be done again. The debate continues. The labyrinth waits, and we carry forward the responsibility of deciding how to relate to heritage that combines architectural brilliance with moral horror, knowledge that illuminates and disturbs, history that warns without guaranteeing we will listen.